Paulie is the kind of man who fills silence with sound. He talks endlessly, tells stories that loop back into themselves, interrupts conversations, laughs too hard at his own jokes. Yet behind all that noise, there's a vacancy that keeps widening as the years go by. The tragedy of Paulie isn't in what happens to him, but in what doesn't. He isn't killed, betrayed, or locked up. He simply fades, slowly, imperceptibly, into the background of a world that no longer needs men like him. His collapse isn't violent, it's existential. A man who thought loyalty was purpose ends up discovering that loyalty, when given to the wrong god, only leads to emptiness. Paulie represents something ancient, not just in mob terms, but in human psychology. He's a creature of hierarchy. His sense of identity is tied entirely to structure, to the idea that if you obey, if you respect, if you follow the chain of command, the universe will reward you. This is the old Catholic logic dressed in gangster clothes. The belief that faith and order bring stability, that sin has rules, that punishment and redemption follow an internal code. Paulie builds his life around that illusion. He believes the mob is a sacred order. Tony is the high priest. The rules are commandments, and his own obedience is a kind of prayer. But the modern world doesn't work that way anymore. By the time Paulie's running with Tony, the structure has rotted. Everyone's self-serving. The rules are flexible, and the only real morality left is profit. But Paulie can't process that. He doesn't see moral decay, he sees betrayal. In his mind, the world isn't changing. The people in it are just breaking the rules. He's still living by a code that no longer exists, and it makes him paranoid, bitter, and constantly on edge. Every conversation becomes a test of loyalty. Every silence feels like judgment. Paulie's obsession with respect is really an obsession with validation. He doesn't have an internal sense of worth. Everything he is depends on how others see him. That's why he worships Tony, why he craves attention, why he brags about his past. It's all an effort to fill a hole that's been there his entire life. The mob gave him structure, but it never gave him identity. He's like a soldier who's forgotten what the war was about, but keeps polishing his medals anyway. There's a fragile dignity to that. Paulie isn't stupid. He knows he's aging. He knows the world's moving past him, but he refuses to admit it. His survival depends on pretending that the old ways still work. When he lectures the younger guys about tradition, when he clings to superstitions, when he complains about how things used to be, it's not nostalgia, it's fear. He's trying to convince himself that his life still makes sense, that he hasn't wasted decades serving a system that stopped caring about him. Underneath that fear is something even deeper: shame. Paulie's entire worldview depends on external order because he has no internal one. He's never learned to question himself, never learned to think beyond hierarchy. So when the hierarchy starts to crumble, he has nowhere to go. The church doesn't mean much anymore. The family's gone, and the mob's just another corporation. What's left? For Paulie, nothing. That emptiness manifests as paranoia. When people like Paulie lose control, they start inventing enemies. It's easier to believe someone's plotting against you than to face the idea that the world simply doesn't need you anymore. Every time Tony excludes him, every time Christopher gets promoted, every time Silvio talks down to him, it confirms Paulie's worst fear, that he's becoming invisible. He reacts by tightening his grip, spying, gossiping, and punishing small disloyalties as if they were mortal sins. But all that effort just isolates him further. The harder he tries to prove his value, the more desperate he looks. Paulie's decline is slow because he doesn't break. He bends, represses, adjusts, and keeps going. He's too disciplined to self-destruct the way Christopher does, too superstitious to openly betray the life, and too afraid to walk away. So he stays in this strange middle ground, a man who obeys out of habit, not belief. He's loyal to a ghost. You can trace this kind of collapse in psychological terms. When someone's identity is built entirely around a system that collapses, the mind starts splitting in two. One part knows the truth, that the old ways are gone. The other refuses to accept it. Paulie lives in that split. His humor, his superstitions, his rigid routines, they're all defense mechanisms. They keep him from acknowledging that he's obsolete. When he prays to saints, checks for bad omens, or avoids mirrors, he's trying to control chaos with ritual. He treats the universe like a mob boss. Appease it, and it might let you live another day. But beneath all those layers of ritual and paranoia, there's a more universal story, the story of a man outliving his purpose. Paulie isn't tragic because he dies, he's tragic because he doesn't. He survives while everything that defined him withers away. His friends die, his enemies disappear, and his world becomes smaller with every season. By the end, he's just another old man who can't stop performing a role that no longer matters. That's the haunting genius of his character. In The Sopranos, death is rarely dramatic. It's quiet, mundane, inevitable. Paulie doesn't get a bullet or a moral epiphany. He gets the slow suffocation of irrelevance. The show doesn't punish him, it forgets him. And for someone who's lived his entire life trying to be seen, that's the cruelest fate of all. Loyalty, for Paulie, is not a choice. It's a condition. It's something that was trained into him long before he ever learned how to think for himself. The idea that obedience brings order, that following the chain of command guarantees protection. These aren't abstract principles for him. They're survival instincts. He grew up in a world where disobedience got you killed or forgotten. To him, loyalty is what separates the righteous from the lost. It's the thing that makes life predictable, structured, safe. But loyalty, when it's absolute, becomes a cage. It replaces thought with repetition. And Paulie is the purest example of that kind of conditioning. He doesn't question Tony. Not because he fully respects him, but because he's terrified of what it would mean if Tony were wrong. If the boss can be wrong, then the entire order of things collapses. The hierarchy Paulie depends on doesn't survive self-reflection. It needs faith, blind, absolute, unbroken faith. This is why Paulie's obedience is often mistaken for stupidity. He's not dumb, he's defensive. The moment he starts questioning his loyalty, he starts questioning his own existence. That's the real terror underneath all his superstition. The idea that everything he's done, every rule he's followed, every drop of blood he's shed in the name of the life, might have meant nothing. The possibility that he's been loyal to an illusion. Tony understands this, and he uses it. Paulie's obedience makes him predictable. He's the kind of soldier a boss dreams of, reliable, never too ambitious, never too curious. But it also makes him expendable. You can control a man like Paulie with scraps of attention, the occasional compliment, or a small position of power. Tony keeps him close enough to feel included, but never close enough to matter. And Paulie, desperate to believe he's still valued, accepts that dynamic without protest. This imbalance defines their relationship. Tony represents modern pragmatism, loyalty that exists only as long as it's useful. Paulie represents old-world obedience, loyalty that exists regardless of outcome. The two men are bound together by mutual need, but separated by belief. Tony sees loyalty as a strategy. Paulie sees it as religion. Over time, that religious devotion becomes hollow. Paulie starts performing loyalty without understanding why. He brings envelopes, repeats slogans, defends the family name, but there's no soul in it anymore. It's muscle memory. The rituals still exist, but the meaning has drained away. You can see it in the way he talks about the old days, how he tries to keep that mythology alive. For him, the mafia isn't just a criminal enterprise. It's a belief system. He treats betrayal like blasphemy and obedience like prayer. But when you live in a world that rewards betrayal, faith becomes poison. The people Paulie looks up to, Tony, Ralph, even Silvio, all manipulate the system for themselves. They adapt, they bend rules, they prioritize survival over principle. Paulie doesn't. He can't. He's still operating under the fantasy that loyalty has moral value. When he sees others bending the code and thriving, something inside him starts to fracture. He starts seeing disloyalty everywhere, because deep down, he knows the problem isn't them, it's him. That's the tragedy of moral rigidity. When you refuse to evolve, every change looks like corruption. Paulie's stuck in a moral time capsule, and it drives him insane. He interprets every shift in the power dynamic as a personal attack. He starts watching everyone too closely, second-guessing motives, misreading gestures. Paranoia becomes a substitute for awareness. The more he doubts, the more he tries to compensate with performance. He becomes louder, more controlling, more judgmental. He bullies subordinates, mocks younger guys, demands respect that no one truly gives him. But all of this is just noise covering fear. The fear that his loyalty has become irrelevant. And that's what makes his collapse so psychological. Paulie's not fighting against the world. He's fighting against the erosion of his own meaning. He doesn't understand that loyalty without purpose is just obedience, and obedience without understanding is just slavery. This is where the show's subtle genius comes in. The Sopranos never humiliates Paulie outright. It just lets him exist long enough for the audience to notice how small he's become. You start to see that his faith in the code isn't noble, It's tragic. The very thing that once gave him identity now traps him inside a shrinking life. He has no family, no partner, no ambitions beyond pleasing the boss. His daily routines, visiting his mother, collecting envelopes, telling old stories, are all rituals designed to maintain stability. But they're not living. They're rehearsals for a life that ended decades ago. His loyalty, once his greatest strength, turns into the quiet mechanism of his undoing. In that sense, Paulie becomes a kind of psychological relic, the embodiment of an extinct mindset. The show surrounds him with men who adapt. Tony manipulates. Christopher rebels. Silvio rationalizes. Paulie just believes. And belief, when it outlives its world, becomes delusion. The saddest part is that he never realizes it. He keeps obeying because he doesn't know how to exist outside of hierarchy. The mob for him is a surrogate parent. It gives him rules instead of love, structure instead of meaning. When he calls Tony the boss, it's not just respect, it's dependency. Tony is the father figure that both defines and imprisons him. You can feel this dynamic most clearly in the way Paulie tries to please him. Every gesture, every story, every envelope he delivers, it's all an attempt to be seen. But Tony's too cold, too distracted, too cynical to give Paulie what he's looking for. Their relationship becomes an endless loop of one man performing loyalty and the other pretending to acknowledge it. It's mechanical, empty, and quietly devastating. Psychologically, Paulie's obedience functions like addiction. He knows it's hurting him, knows it's making him smaller. But the alternative, freedom, terrifies him more. To live without a boss would mean facing himself, and Paulie has spent his entire life avoiding that. He doesn't have a self beyond the soldier. His rank is his identity, and his obedience is his heartbeat. Take that away, and he disappears. By the time Tony starts losing faith in him, Paulie's loyalty has become tragic irony. He's still kneeling before a man who no longer believes in the same gods. He's following commandments that no longer exist. His faith, once his armor, is now his coffin. And yet, that's what makes him human. The refusal to evolve, the desperate clinging to a system long past its prime, the blind faith in order even when it's corrupt. These aren't just mob instincts. They're deeply human ones. Most people would rather stay loyal to the familiar than face the chaos of self-definition. Paulie's obedience isn't stupidity, it's fear dressed as morality. He's not destroyed by betrayal, he's destroyed by time. Holy Walnuts is in many ways the embodiment of a specific kind of American madness. The man who does everything right by the rules of a dying world and still finds himself swallowed by emptiness. It's not just that he's old school, it's that his entire sense of self depends on a moral code that was never truly moral to begin with. His violence, his paranoia, his superstition, all of it comes from the need to make sense of a universe that doesn't reward faithfulness anymore. When he looks in the mirror, he sees a soldier without a war, a believer without a god. He clings to omens and rituals the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. Every dream, every bird, every number on a license plate is a sign from the beyond. He crosses himself before hits. He prays for forgiveness he doesn't actually understand. And beneath it all, there's a suffocating fear, not of death, but of meaninglessness. He wants to believe that his loyalty to the mafia, his decades of work, his survival, all mean something. But Tony's world strips that illusion away bit by bit. Paulie is haunted by guilt, yet he can't name what for. It's not the people he's killed. Those were business. It's the quiet realization that the life he built is hollow, that there's no grace waiting for him at the end of it. Every time Tony or another capo reminds him of his expendability, it drives him closer to spiritual crisis. He's a man who fears purgatory more than hell, because purgatory implies waiting, and Paulie's been waiting his entire life. When he visits his dying mother or sits alone in his living room staring at the walls, the cracks in his armor show. The loud jokes, the obsession with grooming, the fake toughness, all of it is camouflage. He's terrified of being forgotten. The worst fate in his mind isn't death, it's erasure. To Paulie, dying without recognition would mean his life was a waste. And yet, that's exactly where he's heading, toward oblivion in a world that doesn't remember soldiers like him. Tony, for all his sins, still questions himself. He wrestles with doubt, therapy, guilt. He's aware that he's broken. Paulie doesn't have that awareness. His entire identity depends on denying weakness, but that denial slowly drives him insane. His paranoia toward others, Christopher Tony, even random civilians, stems from the same internal split. Deep down, Paulie senses that everything he believed in was a lie, but he can't face it head on, so he projects it outward, turning his inner rot into suspicion of everyone else. It's why his loyalty feels both sacred and suffocating. He needs Tony's approval, not because of love or respect, but because Tony represents the last link to a structure that gives Paulie purpose. When Tony withdraws warmth or treats him as a liability, Paulie crumbles internally. The hierarchy isn't just his job, it's his theology. The boss is God, the rules are scripture, and the rituals are prayer. Without them, he's spiritually homeless. By the later seasons, Paulie becomes a ghost of that old world. He survives everyone, Christopher, Silvio, Ralph, even Tony in a symbolic sense, yet he's the one left wandering in the ruins. He's proof that survival isn't victory. Every joke he cracks about bad luck or cosmic punishment is a confession disguised as humor. He's a man who senses the universe judging him, even though he can't say why. If Tony's tragedy is modern awareness, knowing the game is rigged but playing anyway, Paulie's tragedy is blind devotion. He doesn't adapt, doesn't evolve, doesn't question. He simply keeps walking the same path until the ground beneath him gives out. And in that, he becomes the most tragic figure of them all. He's not consumed by power or greed like others. He's consumed by faith. Faith in a system that no longer exists. Faith in symbols that have lost their meaning. Faith that there's still some cosmic balance keeping score. The truth is, there isn't. And that's the horror that The Sopranos never says out loud, but lets us feel in moments of silence around Paulie. When he stares into nothing, when the laughter fades and he's left alone, you see a man confronting the abyss, not of death, but of meaninglessness. A soldier with no war, a believer with no heaven, a ghost who's still breathing. If Paulie Walnuts has a religion, it isn't Christianity, it's order. The church is just a prop, a place to confess the wrong sins while hiding the real ones. The rosary in his hands, the cross on his neck, the prayers he mumbles before a job. They're not about forgiveness. They're about control. Paulie doesn't pray because he believes in redemption. He prays because he can't live with chaos. Every prayer is a way to bargain with fate, to make sense of a world that no longer plays by rules. In that sense, Paulie is the purest philosophical creature in The Sopranos. Everyone else adapts to the decay of the old system. Tony intellectualizes it. Silvio compartmentalizes it. Christopher numbs it. Paulie, though, believes. He keeps the faith in hierarchy, ritual, and punishment. He thinks life still works on a balance sheet. You sin, you pay, you do a favor, you earn a blessing. But the universe doesn't care, and The Sopranos spends years watching that belief collapse in slow motion. When we talk about fate in this show, we're not talking about destiny, we're talking about gravity. Every character is being pulled downward, by guilt, by greed, by the entropy of their own choices. The difference is how they respond to that pull. Tony tries to intellectualize it, to name it. Paulie denies it altogether. He treats his bad luck like a curse, his success like divine proof, and his guilt like a misunderstanding. That's the only way he can live without shattering. This denial becomes his worldview. He interprets morality like a mob accountant. Steal from the right people, show loyalty to your boss, pay respect to the dead, and somehow it'll all balance out. He thinks of himself as good because he's loyal, because he follows the rules of his tribe. But that's where the psychological dissection begins. Paulie's morality is mechanical, not moral. He acts right to feel safe, not to be good. And that's the core of his tragedy. He doesn't want to understand morality, he wants to manage it. When his priest lectures him, he nods, but the words never land. When he gives to charity or helps his mother, it's transactional. Every act of kindness has a built-in expectation that the universe will see it and pay him back. That's why he obsesses over omens. It's not superstition, it's an accounting system. If a crow lands near his car, that's bad credit. If he finds money in the street, that's divine interest. But beneath this surface arithmetic lies a darker question that The Sopranos asks again and again. What happens when the world stops paying moral debts? When people like Tony and Paulie keep surviving, keep profiting, keep walking away? What does that do to their minds? For Tony, it leads to existential depression. For Paulie, it leads to madness. Paulie's paranoia isn't just fear of betrayal, it's fear that the moral order he believes in has disintegrated. Every time he suspects someone of being a snake, it's because he can't process the idea that loyalty no longer guarantees safety. Every ghost story he tells is a metaphor for his own guilt trying to claw its way into the light. He doesn't see the difference between punishment and coincidence because, deep down, he needs to believe that something, anything, is still keeping score. That's why, in philosophical terms, Paulie is a tragic theist in a godless world. He operates on faith long after faith has lost its power. And in doing so, he reveals something terrifying about human nature, that belief itself can be a prison. His whole existence is an argument against the comfort of tradition. Because while Tony's crisis is intellectual, Paulie's is spiritual. He's not wrestling with ideas, he's wrestling with ghosts, the ghosts of every rule that used to make sense. In a way, Paulie's story runs parallel to the decline of the mafia itself. Both are institutions built on old codes of honor, superstition, and hierarchy. Both survive longer than they should, and both rot from within. The rules don't protect anyone anymore, they just give the illusion of purpose. Paulie is the last man standing because he refuses to evolve, but survival becomes his curse. He outlives his meaning. The fascinating part is that Paulie isn't dumb. He has flashes of self-awareness, brief, painful moments where he senses the absurdity of it all, when he realizes that the people he's killed don't haunt Tony, or that the money he hoards brings him no peace. You can see something break behind his eyes, but then he quickly seals it up again with ritual, with humor, with cruelty. It's easier to be a believer than a philosopher. What separates Paulie from Tony, then, is how they face the void. Tony tries to talk his way out of it. Paulie prays. Both fail, but Paulie's failure is quieter and more pitiful. He's not destroyed by guilt, but by faith, by the unbearable weight of believing in a structure that no longer exists. He's the man who still kneels before a silent altar, waiting for an answer that never comes. And this is where The Sopranos turns philosophical in its most brutal way. It suggests that morality, fate, and belief are all human inventions, temporary scaffolding against chaos. Paulie is the last true believer, and that makes him both holy and insane. His life is proof that structure can't save the human soul if it's built on fear. The gun and the prayer sit side by side on his nightstand, both tools of survival, both symbols of control. One kills the body, the other soothes the mind. And in the end, Paulie doesn't know which one he trusts more. If Tony Soprano is the face of moral decay, then Paulie Gualtieri is its echo, a reflection of what happens when decay becomes identity. They are two sides of the same structure, built from the same bricks, but weathered by different storms. Tony, for all his cunning and self-awareness, knows deep down that the world he's inherited is collapsing. He feels the erosion of power, the fading influence of the life. Paulie, on the other hand, refuses to see it. He doesn't evolve, doesn't question, doesn't think beyond his next envelope or his next Sunday dinner. He treats every order from Tony as sacred, every insult as treason, every superstition as cosmic truth. But The Sopranos is a show about time, and time punishes those who can't adapt. Paulie's downfall isn't a gun to the head or a betrayal in the dark. It's something slower, more humiliating. Irrelevance. The world keeps moving while he stays frozen in his own mythology. Tony watches himself slide morally, but Paulie doesn't even realize he's fallen. He mistakes survival for success. The psychological dissection of Paulie begins where his loyalty becomes pathology. His obedience to the code isn't noble, it's compulsive. He doesn't follow rules because he believes in them. He follows them because he's terrified of what life would be without them. The mafia gives him a skeleton to hang his mind on. Without it, he's just a man haunted by guilt, aging without legacy. The rituals, the hierarchy, the chain of command, these are his medicine. He takes them every day to keep from facing the emptiness underneath. Tony, by contrast, knows he's sick. He analyzes it in therapy, intellectualizes it, turns it into philosophy. But Paulie doesn't have that luxury. He's not introspective enough to diagnose himself. Instead, he builds a cage of structure around his paranoia, a worldview where every small betrayal is proof of cosmic order, every death is divine justice. The universe isn't chaotic to him. It's personal. Everything that happens is either a message or a test. This is what makes Paulie so tragic. His faith in structure is also his doom. When you believe the world has rules, every time it breaks them, your sanity cracks a little more. And by the final years of the show, Paulie is a man made of cracks. He's jittery, superstitious, obsessed with omens and curses. He sees signs everywhere because he can't bear to face meaninglessness. Tony, for all his darkness, can stare into the void and still function. Paulie can't. He needs his rituals, his rosaries, his routines, small talismans to hold off collapse. But the deeper truth is that The Sopranos uses Paulie to show the slow extinction of belief itself. Every institution in the show, religion, family, business, the mafia, begins as a system built on loyalty and ends as a network of survival. No one trusts anyone. Every code is corrupted. Tony breaks omerta by seeing a therapist. Carmela turns faith into a shield for guilt. Christopher trades loyalty for validation. And Paulie, the one who clings to the rules, becomes the most hollow of all. The irony is that Paulie thinks he's the last real gangster. He still talks about honor, respect, the life. He polishes his image like it's the last thing keeping him human. But behind that surface is just a frightened old man trying to freeze time. He lives like it's 1975 in a world that's long since digitized, commercialized, and moved on. When Tony and his crew discuss money laundering or real estate, Paulie's eyes glaze over. He doesn't understand this new version of organized crime. He only understands envelopes, sit-downs, and tribute. That's why Paulie's relationship with Tony becomes one of quiet resentment. He respects Tony as the boss, but he can't comprehend the man. Tony is cynical, pragmatic, and modern, willing to bend the code when it suits him. Paulie, by contrast, treats the code as religion. To him, Tony's flexibility is blasphemy, but he's too dependent to rebel, too afraid to step out of line. So he lives in that emotional contradiction, loyalty to a man he resents, obedience to a system he no longer believes in. And that's the essence of his psychological cage. He confuses loyalty with purpose. As long as he has someone to serve, he can ignore how empty his life is. Tony uses power to escape meaninglessness. Paulie uses obedience. Both are running from the same truth, that nothing in their world truly matters anymore. The contrast with Christopher makes this even clearer. Christopher's tragedy is that he wants to evolve. He wants to make movies, to be an artist, to break free of the cycle. Paulie's tragedy is that he doesn't even know how. When Christopher tries to discuss morality or the modern world, Paulie dismisses it as weakness. But when Christopher dies, Paulie doesn't gain power. He gains emptiness. One more person gone, one more ghost on his conscience. The family shrinks until Paulie becomes a relic, surrounded by people half his age who don't care about the old rules. And so we begin to see what the show has been building toward all along. Paulie isn't surviving. He's decaying. The laughter, the vanity, the loud stories about his past. They're all camouflage for fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of being punished, fear of dying without meaning. He clings to routine because routine is memory, and memory is identity. If he keeps the rituals alive, maybe he can trick himself into thinking the world hasn't changed. This is the heart of his collapse. Paulie doesn't die because of betrayal or bad luck. He dies spiritually long before the show ends. His soul slowly caves in under the weight of superstition and denial. He becomes a ghost of his own making, still walking, still talking, but detached from reality. His paranoia isn't madness. It's grief. Grief for the world that left him behind. In philosophical terms, Paulie represents the tragedy of the believer in a post-belief world. He's what happens when a person builds their identity on systems that no longer function. The mob isn't a brotherhood anymore, it's a business. The church isn't a moral guide, it's a background aesthetic. And loyalty doesn't protect anyone. It just slows down the inevitable. Paulie embodies the refusal to accept that truth. And yet, that's what makes him such a powerful figure. Because unlike Tony, who sees the rot and despairs, Paulie keeps the faith. His delusion gives him purpose. He's wrong, but he's alive. He's the last man holding a candle in a burned-out cathedral, refusing to admit the light is gone. And in that stubbornness lies a strange kind of purity. The purity of a man too afraid to change, but too loyal to quit. Paulie's world ends not with violence, but with silence. The friends are gone, the rules are hollow, and the laughter rings false. He sits alone, waiting for a call that never comes, looking around a house filled with trophies that mean nothing. He's won the game only to realize the prize was survival, and survival is just another kind of punishment. And that's where The Sopranos leaves him. A man preserved in amber, too tough to die, too lost to live. His story isn't a fall, it's an unending stagnation. The slow death of purpose in a man who refuses to stop believing.